You are now settling in, the weight of the day easing from your shoulders, the hum of the world softening into silence. In this quiet, I will speak to you as I once spoke only to myself, in the solitude of candlelight. My life was long, filled with contradictions, triumphs and follies, and though centuries have passed, my voice lingers, waiting to tell you how an obscure boy became a man whose face now rests on your $100 bill. I was born in Boston in the year 1706, the 15th of 17 children. My father was a maker of soap and candles, a modest trade that kept us clothed and fed but never rich. The smell of tallow clung to the walls of our home, the flicker of flames from molds and wicks marking the rhythm of our days. From the first, it was clear I was no heir to wealth or station. My inheritance was instead curiosity, a restless hunger of the mind. While others were content to repeat the prayers and chores of daily life, I questioned, I listened. I read whatever scraps of paper I could find, devouring words as though they were food for a starving spirit. My schooling was brief, for my father could not afford much beyond the basics. I was apprenticed to my brother James, a printer, and there I discovered the intoxicating power of the press, the clatter of type, the press of ink against paper, the smell of fresh sheets drying on lines. These were the sounds and scents of possibility. My brother was stern, often cruel, but through him, I learned the craft that would become my first weapon, the ability to shape words not only for myself, but for the eyes and minds of many. I was young, restless, impatient. At night I borrowed books, teaching myself philosophy, science, history. By day I worked the press, hands stained with ink, eyes heavy with exhaustion. My brother forbade me from publishing under my own name, so I created a disguise. I invented a character, a witty widow named Silence Doe Good, and through her I slipped essays into his paper. The people of Boston laughed, debated, quoted me, never knowing that the widow whose wisdom they admired was a boy in his teens. That deception revealed to me a truth that would shape my life. Identity matters less than ideas. A name can be forgotten. A well-shaped thought can outlive its author. But pride and youth often clash with authority, and my brother's temper soon became unbearable. The lash of his words, the constraints of his command, I would not endure them, so I fled. At 17, with little more than a few coins in my pocket and dreams heavier than my bundle, I left Boston behind. The road carried me to New York, but it was Philadelphia where I found my true beginning. I remember that arrival as if it were yesterday. I was ragged, dirty, hungry. My pockets were nearly empty, my stomach growling, my clothes stained with travel. I walked the streets with rolls of bread tucked under each arm, biting into one as curious onlookers stared. There was no grandeur in my entrance, no herald announcing my arrival. I was merely another face in the crowd, a runaway apprentice seeking a chance. But in my heart, I carried conviction that with industry, frugality, and wit, I would rise. Philadelphia welcomed me with opportunity. Printers needed hands, presses needed tending, and my skill earned me work. I lodged in humble quarters, ate sparingly, and saved every coin. By day I labored, by night I studied, seeking knowledge wherever it could be found. The libraries became my sanctuaries, my true temples. I read essays, science, philosophy, history, poetry. I read not for leisure, but for power. For each book was a tool, each idea a stepping stone out of obscurity. I learned not only from pages, but from people. I observed how men spoke, how they argued, how they persuaded. I listened in taverns, in workshops, in the marketplace, gathering not gossip, but insight into human nature. For I understood early that to rise in life requires not only talent, but understanding of the hearts and minds of others. My industry soon caught the eye of influential men, and opportunities multiplied. But still, I was cautious, patient, careful to balance ambition with prudence. For every step forward, I asked myself what habits, what virtues, what principles would carry me further. I began to craft my life deliberately, as if it were a book I was writing chapter by chapter. Later, I would publish my list of virtues, those 13 principles of conduct. But even then, as a youth, I practiced the art of self-discipline. I made mistakes, of course, vanity, impulsiveness, passions unchecked, but always I sought to correct myself, to forge character as surely as I forged type on a press. In those early years, my success was humble but steady. I established my own printing shop, producing not only newspapers but almanacs, filled with wit, wisdom, and proverbs. Through Poor Richard's Almanack, I spoke to farmers and merchants, to housewives and laborers, offering not lofty philosophy, but plain counsel. Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Such sayings were not always mine, but I chose them, shaped them, gave them rhythm, and in doing so, I shaped a culture. I became not just a printer, but a voice, a presence in the daily lives of thousands. Yet as I reflect in these quiet hours, I see how improbable it all was. The candlemaker's son, with scarcely 2 years of formal schooling, became a writer, a printer, a philosopher. How? By refusing to accept the limits imposed upon me, by turning every hardship into fuel, every restriction into a challenge, by rising early, working late, spending little, reading much, and never ceasing to ask questions. I tell you this now, not to boast, but to remind you that greatness does not require noble birth or endless wealth. It requires discipline, curiosity, resilience. It requires a mind willing to labor as hard as the hands. As I close this first chapter of my story, I see again that boy in Philadelphia, bread under his arm, dirt on his clothes, but fire in his eyes. He did not yet know of electricity, of France, of declarations and constitutions. He knew only hunger, for food, yes, but more for knowledge, for advancement, for the chance to prove that circumstance does not define destiny, and that hunger would carry him step by step into the very heart of history. When I left Boston behind, I carried nothing but a few coins and a restless determination that no chains of apprenticeship or family quarrels could contain. My brother's harsh hand and sharp tongue had driven me away, but in truth, I had long been ready to outgrow the narrow confines of his print shop. The moment I stepped aboard the sloop bound for New York, I felt the world open, the salt air, the creak of timbers, the endless horizon. It was as if the sea itself promised reinvention. I was no longer merely James Franklin's troublesome apprentice. I was a free man, though penniless, with the wide unknown stretched before me. New York offered little, and soon my journey carried me further to Philadelphia, where fate began to show its hand. I can still see the city as I first did, muddy streets lined with brick houses, the Delaware River alive with ships from distant lands, and the bustle of tradesmen, merchants, and apprentices going about their work. I was ragged, hungry, carrying only a small bundle, yet the energy of the place filled me with possibility. I bought rolls of bread with my last coins and walked through the streets with them tucked under my arms, an image that amused the good citizens who stared at me, wondering what kind of odd fellow I must be. It was in Philadelphia that I found my first true footing. I sought work in the printing trade, and fortune favored me with employment under Samuel Keimer, a printer whose shop was disorganized and poorly managed. He was not the finest of masters, but he gave me a place at the press, and that was all I needed. I worked with zeal, correcting errors, improving processes, showing him the skill my brother had taught me, even if he had given me no praise. Keimer may have been a careless printer, but I was not. I was hungry, and hunger sharpens the mind and the hand alike. I soon made the acquaintance of men of influence, among them Governor Keith, who took an interest in my industrious spirit. He spoke to me with warmth, promising to sponsor me in establishing my own printing business. For a young man like me, scarcely out of apprenticeship, the prospect dazzled. Keith painted visions of my own shop, my own press, my own name carried by newspapers and almanacs. He urged me to travel to London to acquire the equipment I would need, assuring me that letters of credit and support awaited me. Naive though I was, I believed him. So I sailed once more across the ocean, this time not as a runaway boy, but as a young man filled with ambition. The weeks at sea were long, the waves relentless, but my mind was full of plans, of typefaces and ink, of pamphlets and customers, of the empire of words I would build in Philadelphia. Yet when I arrived in London, I discovered the cruel truth. There were no letters, no credit, no support. Governor Keith's promises had been nothing but air. I was stranded, penniless once more in the greatest city of the age. It was a bitter lesson, but I was not undone. In London, I sought work in the printing houses and quickly proved my worth. My hands were swift, my mind sharp, my demeanor steady. Employers valued me, and I earned enough to live, though in modest quarters and with no luxuries. London offered me more than mere employment. It offered books, ideas, conversations. I spent hours in coffee houses, listening to debates, reading whatever pamphlets and treatises I could afford. I discovered new philosophies, new sciences, and I began to shape a worldview broader than the narrow lanes of Boston or even the bustling streets of Philadelphia could provide. It was in London, too, that I learned the value of independence. No patron would save me. No promises could be trusted. Only my own labor, my own frugality, my own wit would carry me forward. I embraced a life of simplicity. Meat rarely, water often, work always. I trained not only my body but my mind, teaching myself logic, writing, even music. Every hour was turned toward improvement. After nearly 2 years in London, I returned to Philadelphia, older, wiser, and more cautious. I took once again to printing, but this time with greater ambition. I built friendships with men of learning and enterprise, for I understood now that success comes not only from skill, but from the company one keeps. Together we formed discussion groups, reading clubs, circles of inquiry. We debated philosophy, experimented with science, planned enterprises. These gatherings would grow into the Junto, a society dedicated to mutual improvement, where tradesmen and thinkers alike sharpened one another as iron sharpens iron. In those years, I laid the foundation for my future. I worked not for immediate wealth, but for independence. I lived frugally, reinvested earnings, and steadily built a reputation for reliability and wit. When opportunities came, I seized them. Contracts to print government documents, chances to publish newspapers, projects to print almanacs filled with humor and wisdom. Step by step, I transformed from a runaway apprentice to a master printer, from a boy with bread under his arm to a man with words in every household. And yet, I knew even then that printing was only the beginning. The press gave me a voice, but my curiosity reached beyond ink and paper. I saw in every trade, every experiment, every discussion a chance to improve, to learn, to discover. I did not seek only profit. I sought usefulness. To be useful to my fellow men, that was the creed I lived by. Whether in business, in science, or in public service, I wished to leave behind something that endured. As I look back, I see those early Philadelphia years as the crucible in which my character was tested. I had fled Boston, been deceived in London, labored in poverty, yet each trial hardened me, taught me, prepared me. By the time my own shop prospered, I was not merely a printer. I was a man who had tasted disappointment and refused to yield, a man who had learned to rely upon no one but himself, and a man who understood that the surest way to rise is not through luck or favor, but through steady, patient industry. It is a lesson I carry still. Promises may fail, fortunes may vanish, friends may betray. But the man who wakes early, works diligently, spends wisely, and learns constantly cannot be defeated. That was the truth I discovered as a youth in Philadelphia, and it became the guiding principle of my entire life. In those early years of my trade, as my press clattered and my hands grew black with ink, I discovered that words were not only a means of employment, but a means of power. A printer does more than copy letters upon paper. He becomes the messenger of ideas, the voice of a community, the mirror of its hopes and fears. I learned quickly that to print was to shape, and to shape was to lead. My newspaper grew, slowly at first, but steadily. I filled it not merely with reports, but with essays, satire, observations on daily life. I found that people hungered not only for news, but for wit, for guidance, for reflection upon their own lives. I offered them proverbs, jokes, little stories that carried lessons without sermon. In this way, I became both tradesman and teacher, merchant and philosopher. My words slipped into kitchens and workshops, into taverns and parlors, and in them readers found a companion. But it was with Poor Richard's Almanack that my pen found its truest reach. Almanacks were common, full of calendars, weather predictions, and simple advice. I chose to make mine uncommon by weaving it with wit and wisdom. I invented a character, Richard Saunders, a humble yet shrewd fellow whose sayings captured truths both practical and amusing. Through him, I spoke of thrift and diligence, of patience and prudence, yet always with a twinkle of humor that made the lessons go down more easily. Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A penny saved is a penny earned. Fish and visitors stink in 3 days. These maxims, and countless others, spread across the colonies. Farmers quoted them, merchants repeated them, housewives taught them to their children. Poor Richard became a companion in households far beyond Philadelphia, and with each edition my influence grew. It was not wealth alone that I pursued, though the almanac made me prosperous, but the chance to shape the character of a people. For I believed that a republic requires virtue as much as it requires laws, and if I could cultivate habits of industry and frugality, of honesty and moderation, then I was serving the public as much as any statesman. My own life reflected those values. I rose early, worked diligently, avoided extravagance, and practiced frugality. I drew up a list of virtues by which I endeavored to live: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. I tracked my progress in a little book, marking failures, correcting habits. Of course, I often fell short, but the discipline itself was useful. Perfection was never achieved, but improvement always possible. In this, I discovered that the pursuit of virtue is itself the foundation of strength. As my prosperity grew, I sought not only to enrich myself, but to enrich the city around me. I founded a library so that men who could not afford books might still have access to knowledge. I organized fire brigades, for I knew that flames respect no fortune and that community must defend itself. I helped establish a hospital, a college, and countless other institutions that carried forward the principle I held dearest, that a man is most useful when he is useful to others. My printing gave me wealth, but service gave me purpose. I recall walking through Philadelphia in those days, watching the cobblestones glisten with rain, hearing the calls of merchants and the cries of children. I felt pride not only in my own success, but in the life of the city. I saw the library shelves, once empty, filling with volumes. I saw men in uniform rushing to put out fires before they consumed a neighbor's home. I saw apprentices, eager and bright, reading pamphlets and learning skills. And I thought to myself, here lies the true treasure, not in coins locked away, but in minds and communities strengthened. Still, I was never content with what I had done. My curiosity drove me further. The press was my livelihood, but the world itself was my book, and every day I turned another page. I studied science in my spare hours, tinkered with experiments, pondered the nature of electricity, of heat, of motion. I invented devices not to enrich myself, but to make life easier for others. The Franklin stove to warm homes more efficiently, bifocal glasses to ease weary eyes, lightning rods to protect houses and churches from heaven's fire. I saw no division between practical invention and lofty philosophy. Both served the same end, the improvement of mankind. Some mocked me for my endless curiosity, for my tendency to poke and prod into matters beyond my trade. But I believed firmly that knowledge is the only treasure that increases when shared. What use is wisdom if it is locked away? What use is discovery if it remains hidden? So I published my findings, shared my experiments, and encouraged others to question, to test, to explore. A community of inquiry began to form, men of different trades and backgrounds uniting under the simple banner of curiosity. In this way, Philadelphia became not merely a city of commerce, but a city of ideas. Looking back, I see those years as the flowering of my life. From the runaway boy, hungry and ragged, I had grown into a man of means and influence. Yet it was not the wealth that pleased me most. It was the sense that I had become useful, that my life was not wasted in idle pursuits, but devoted to leaving behind something of worth. The printing press gave me a voice, but it was service to others that gave that voice weight. When I wrote in Poor Richard S. Almanack that well done is better than well said, I was speaking as much to myself as to my readers. Words are powerful, but deeds are greater. And if I have any pride, it is not in the cleverness of my sayings, but in the libraries, the hospitals, the fire brigades, the colleges that grew from them. These were the true monuments, the true proof that industry and cooperation can transform a community. In the quiet of night, when the press was stilled and the candles burned low, I would sometimes reflect upon the improbable path that had brought me here. The boy who had fled Boston in disgrace now shaped the habits and thoughts of thousands. The apprentice who had once written under false names now signed his words openly, and those words were welcomed. The man who had nearly starved upon arriving in Philadelphia now provided bread and books for others. If there is a lesson in this, it is simple. Diligence, frugality, and curiosity may carry a man further than birth or fortune ever could. And yet, even in this season of prosperity, I sensed that my path was not yet complete. The press had given me wealth. Invention had given me renown. But greater storms loomed on the horizon. The colonies stirred with unrest. The empire grew heavy with its demands, and whispers of liberty began to echo in taverns and assemblies. I had built a life of words and deeds, but destiny would call me to greater work still. Not merely the improvement of a city, but the birth of a nation. In those years when my printing business had grown secure and my reputation in Philadelphia was established, I found myself restless once again. Commerce and wit were not enough for me. My mind, insatiable, hungered for the secrets of nature herself. I had always felt the pull of science, for in it lay both beauty and utility. A man may speculate on the heavens, but I wished to bring heaven's fire down to earth, to understand its nature, and perhaps to tame it for the service of mankind. It was electricity that most fascinated me. I had read of the experiments of Europeans, of sparks leaping from rubbed glass, of small shocks that startled the curious. I determined to pursue it myself, not merely for amusement, but to see whether such phenomena might be put to useful ends. I constructed apparatus as best I could with what Philadelphia afforded me. Leyden jars, glass globes, wires and rods. I gathered friends to witness my demonstrations, and in dimly lit rooms we created sparks that danced like miniature bolts of lightning. We saw that electricity could pass through water, through metal, even through the human body. I observed that sharp points drew off the fire silently, that it could be stored and discharged, that it obeyed laws which once known might be harnessed. I called one condition positive, the other negative, and though simple in terms, these words gave shape to forces as old as creation. The world laughed at such pursuits, some calling them trifles, others witchcraft. But I believed nature's secrets, once revealed, could protect life, preserve property, and advance knowledge. So I pressed on, writing letters, sending reports across the Atlantic, exchanging observations with men in London and Paris. They marveled that a colonial printer should offer insights equal to Europe's finest philosophers. But truth cares little for birthplace. Curiosity is the birthright of all men. It was in the summer of 1752 that I performed the experiment for which I am most remembered. I had long suspected that lightning itself was but electricity on a vast scale, the same spark we drew in our chambers magnified by nature's storm. To test it, I fastened a wire to the top of a simple kite, attaching it with silk to insulate the current, and to the wire I fixed a key. My son William accompanied me, loyal and eager, though I knew well the danger. Together, we raised the kite into the thunderclouds, its string trembling in the rain-soaked wind. At first, nothing. Then, as the storm raged, I saw the fibers of the twine stand on end, heard the faint crackle, and felt the key tingle with invisible fire. I pressed my knuckle close and a spark leapt forth, undeniable, thrilling. Lightning and electricity were one. The heavens had revealed their secret. That discovery brought me renown beyond the colonies. My letters and papers were published in Europe, my theories debated in royal societies, my name spoken with admiration in salons where once no colonial would have been admitted. Yet it was not fame I sought, but utility. For from that experiment came the lightning rod, a simple device of metal that could draw fire harmlessly from the sky and save homes and churches from destruction. What good is knowledge if it serves only the vanity of the discoverer? Knowledge must protect, must serve, must ease the burdens of mankind. That was always my creed. The lightning rod spread quickly, and with it, gratitude. Farmers, merchants, ministers blessed the invention, for their barns and steeples no longer fell prey to storms. Yet in some quarters it drew suspicion, as though diverting heaven's bolts was blasphemy. To such critics, I replied that God gave us reason not to neglect it. If the Almighty allows a man to discover a means to preserve life, surely it is no sin to use it. In time, reason prevailed, and the rods stood proud upon roofs across the land, silent sentinels against destruction. Electricity was not my only pursuit. I invented the Franklin stove to warm homes more efficiently, conserving fuel for families who could scarce afford it. I devised bifocal spectacles so that aging eyes might read and see at distance without the clumsy exchange of lenses. I designed the harmonica, a musical instrument of glass bowls that produced tones so pure they seemed drawn from another world. None of these I patented, for I believed that inventions are gifts, not possessions, and that their benefit to society outweighs any profit to the inventor. My reward was the knowledge that I had eased lives, warmed families, sharpened eyes, delighted ears. My curiosity ranged further still. I studied winds and currents, charted the Gulf Stream that ships might sail swifter across the Atlantic. I examined weather, noting patterns, predicting storms, seeking to understand the invisible forces that shaped our world. I dissected the nature of heat, of sound, of magnetism. No question was too small, no phenomenon too humble. For in every corner of nature lay a principle waiting to be uncovered, and from every principle some usefulness might spring. In these endeavors, I never considered myself a philosopher apart, but a man among men, sharing what I found freely, inviting others to test, to challenge, to refine. Science is no kingdom ruled by one mind. It is a republic of inquiry, where truth is advanced not by decree, but by experiment. I was proud to play my part, to correspond with Europe's finest minds, to prove that in the wilderness of America, intellect could flourish as brightly as in any palace of London or Paris. I recall the wonder on the faces of neighbors as they watched sparks leap from my apparatus, as I explained that the same force danced in their bodies, lit their skies, bound their world together. I recall too the humbler satisfactions when a farmer thanked me for the stove that warmed his children, or a minister for the rod that saved his church. These moments confirmed my conviction that science, wedded to service, ennobles both the discoverer and the community. As I reflect, I see clearly that my experiments were but an extension of the habits I had practiced since youth: curiosity, frugality, and usefulness. To take what was common, a kite, a key, a stove, a pair of lenses, and to transform it into something that improved lives. That was the pattern of my life, whether in business, in science, or later in politics. The principle never changed: be useful. And so, though I began as a printer, I became also an inventor, a scientist, a philosopher of nature. These roles did not replace one another, but enriched one another. For the mind that questions in one realm will question in all. From type to thunder, from paper to lightning, the path is not so long as it seems. It is the path of curiosity, of a mind unwilling to accept ignorance when inquiry is possible. When I think of that day with the kite, the storm raging, the spark leaping from the key, I see more than an experiment. I see a symbol of my life, a poor man raising a simple tool into the heavens, daring to question, daring to test, daring to draw down power that others feared untouchable. And from that boldness, from that refusal to accept mystery as final, came knowledge that served the world. That is the essence of my story and of the age I helped to shape. As my years in Philadelphia unfolded, my role as a printer and man of science slowly expanded into that of a public servant and politician. It was not ambition for office that drew me into such affairs, but rather the same principle that guided all my endeavors: usefulness. A man who has knowledge, resources, or influence and does not place them at the service of the community is, in my judgment, wasting both his gifts and his life. So it was that I began to lend my hand to matters of governance, first in small ways, then in larger ways. It started with local assemblies, meetings of citizens to improve the life of the city. I had already founded the library, organized the fire brigade, and supported institutions of learning and health. These efforts brought me respect, and with respect came expectation. Men looked to me for guidance in matters beyond books and inventions. They asked me to serve in Pennsylvania's assembly, and though I hesitated at first, for politics is a mire in which many sink, I accepted. I believed that by applying the same industry and prudence that had served me in business, I might also improve the affairs of the province. The assembly was no easy school. It was filled with competing interests, quarrels over land and taxes, disputes between colonists and proprietors. The Penn family, who claimed ownership of vast tracts of Pennsylvania, often clashed with the common settlers who bore the burdens of defense and taxation. I spoke for the latter, believing that the government must serve those who labor, not merely those who inherit. My writings and speeches on the matter made me both allies and enemies, but I never feared opposition when the cause was just. One of the great questions of the time was defense. The colonies, spread thin along the coast, faced threats from French forces and their native allies. Raids burned farms, settlers trembled, and yet our assemblies argued endlessly over how much to spend and who should bear the cost. I proposed that we organize militias, raise funds fairly, and cooperate among colonies. To many, this sounded both bold and dangerous. They preferred to quarrel locally rather than unite regionally. But I pressed the point, convinced that disunity was our greatest weakness. In 1754, I traveled to Albany for a Congress of Colonies, summoned to discuss alliances and defense. It was there I proposed what became known as the Albany Plan of Union. I suggested that the colonies, though each retaining its own government, should unite under a common council for matters of defense, trade, and relations with native tribes. I sketched the plan quickly, and though it was rejected, the colonies fearing loss of independence, the Crown fearing loss of control, it was the seed of an idea that would, years later, grow into the United States itself. I recall my cartoon of a snake severed into parts with the words, "Join or die." It was a simple image, but its truth was profound. Divided, we would perish. United, we might endure. Though the plan failed, I did not despair. I had learned that new ideas often meet resistance, and that persistence, not immediate victory, is the measure of success. The colonies were not ready then, but the notion of union was planted, and time would water it. In the meantime, I continued my work in Pennsylvania, striving to balance the power of proprietors with the needs of settlers, to secure defense without crushing taxation, to advance fairness in law. My reputation carried me across the Atlantic as well. I was chosen to represent Pennsylvania in London, to plead our case before the Crown and its ministers. There I spent many years navigating the halls of Parliament, conversing with lords and thinkers, seeking remedies for our disputes with the proprietors and the Empire. At first, I admired Britain's grandeur, its order, its culture. I hoped sincerely that the colonies might prosper under its guidance, sharing in its glory. But I also began to see the arrogance with which it treated us, the disdain of men who saw in us only subjects, not partners. Their ears were polite, but their hearts were closed. Even so, my years in London were not wasted. I built connections, deepened my studies of science, and served as a kind of ambassador for America before America yet existed as a nation. I debated, argued, published, always striving to make our position understood. And though many Englishmen dismissed us, others welcomed my ideas, my discoveries, my character. It was a strange life, a colonial printer's son mingling with dukes and philosophers, respected in salons, honored by societies. Yet I never forgot that I was there not for myself, but for Pennsylvania, for the colonies, for the people whose farms and towns were left vulnerable while empires quarreled. When I returned to Philadelphia, I brought with me not only experience, but a deepened conviction that our destiny could not remain forever in Britain as shadow. The seeds of discontent were already sprouting, taxes imposed without consent, restrictions on trade, soldiers quartered among us. I had seen the empire's pride, its blindness, and I knew it would not yield easily to our pleas. Still, I counseled patience, hoping to delay conflict, hoping that reason might prevail. But reason is a delicate thing in the company of power. In those days, I often walked through the streets of Philadelphia at dawn, the city still quiet, the air cool. I thought of the path I had taken, from apprentice to master, from inventor to statesman, from colonial subject to representative abroad. I thought of the people, ordinary and industrious, who deserved peace, justice, and opportunity. And I resolved that whatever role I played next, it would be in service of them, not of kings or proprietors. Thus my life entered a new phase, where science and business gave way increasingly to politics and diplomacy, where the fate of communities, provinces, and ultimately a continent rested in the balance. I did not seek it, yet I could not refuse it. For when a man sees the need of his country, and knows he has the ability to answer, he must not turn away. And so, with steady step, I moved from the workshop of invention to the workshop of nationhood, ready to labor again, not with type and ink, but with laws, assemblies, and the hearts of men. When I first set foot in London as the representative of Pennsylvania, I felt a mixture of awe and pride. The city was the greatest I had ever seen, its streets alive with merchants from every corner of the globe, its buildings vast and ornate, its coffeehouses buzzing with debate. Here was the empire at its heart, and I believed that if reason could be found anywhere, it would be found in these halls of power. I carried with me petitions and arguments from my fellow colonists, confident that if only our grievances were heard, justice would follow. For many years I worked to maintain that hope. I spoke before ministers, wrote pamphlets, attended meetings with lords and scholars. I explained again and again that the colonies were loyal subjects, eager to remain part of Britain. But that loyalty must be met with fairness. We asked not for special privilege, only that taxes not be levied without representation, that laws not be imposed without our consent. To me, it seemed a modest and reasonable request. To them, it seemed insolence. At first, I was treated with courtesy, welcomed into salons and societies, honored for my experiments with electricity and my discoveries of natural philosophy. I was elected to the Royal Society, praised for my wit and my science. In such circles, I felt like an equal, a colonial perhaps, but one whose mind was respected. Yet when I crossed into the realm of politics, the tone changed. There I was reminded constantly that I was an outsider, a provincial, a mere printer's son, daring to question the authority of Parliament. The arrogance of many in London was stifling. They saw in us only subjects useful for trade, for raw materials, for taxes, but unworthy of voice in their councils. When I warned them that such treatment would sow resentment, they laughed, certain that the colonies could never stand against the might of Britain. They did not understand the spirit of independence already alive in our towns and assemblies. They mistook patience for submission and humility for weakness. Still, I labored on, believing persuasion might yet succeed. I met with ministers, sent letters, published essays. I sought compromise, urging my countrymen to remain calm, urging Britain to relent. Yet each year, the gulf widened. New taxes, new restrictions, new insults. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the constant reminders that our assemblies were subordinate. Our voices silenced. I pleaded, reasoned, argued, but in the end my efforts met stone walls. The breaking point came in a humiliation I will never forget. I had supported a petition from Massachusetts protesting the behavior of its royal governor, believing that if only the Crown knew the extent of his abuses, justice would be done. Instead, my enemies in London turned the matter against me. I was called before the Privy Council, ridiculed, berated, treated as though I were a criminal rather than a representative. They shouted at me, mocked me, accused me of sedition. I stood silent, enduring the storm, knowing that any protest would be used against me. But inside, something broke. In that chamber, I saw clearly that reconciliation was no longer possible. Britain would not listen. It would not change. It would rule or it would destroy. And in either case, America must choose its own path. After that day, I ceased to plead for compromise. My writings grew sharper. My sympathy shifted fully to the cause of independence. I had entered London hopeful that I might preserve the empire. I left it convinced that only separation would save us. When I sailed back to Philadelphia, the Atlantic winds carried more than my ship. They carried the certainty that a storm was coming and that I would stand with my countrymen in it. The years in London taught me much. They showed me the glittering heights of science and culture, where ideas were exchanged freely and inventions celebrated. They also showed me the corrosive pride of empire, blind to the dignity of its own subjects. I saw both brilliance and folly, generosity and arrogance. And from it all I learned that nations like men can be ruined by hubris as surely as by weakness. When I returned home, I found the colonies already stirring with unrest. The cry of liberty echoed more loudly, the anger at Britain's decrees sharper. Farmers, merchants, tradesmen all felt the burden of a distant power that treated them as tools, not partners. I carried with me not only the memory of insult, but also the conviction that we could and must stand for ourselves. The time of petitions was over. The time of resistance had begun. In the quiet of night, as I reflected on those years abroad, I realized how far I had traveled, not just in distance, but in thought. I had once believed we were but children of Britain, destined always to live under her guidance. Now I saw that we were grown, and that to remain in her shadow would stunt us forever. Independence was no longer a dream whispered in taverns. It was the only path left to dignity, to justice, to survival. And I, who had once bent every effort to preserve the empire, was now prepared to help dismantle it. When I returned from London, I stepped back onto Philadelphia's streets with the knowledge that everything had changed. The patience I had once counseled was gone. The hope of reconciliation burned away by arrogance and insult. The colonies were no longer whispering about liberty. They were shouting it, printing it, marching it through the streets. And though I was older now, my hair turning grey, my body less vigorous, my resolve was younger and fiercer than ever. I had seen the pride of empire, and I knew at last that we must free ourselves from it. The air was alive with meetings, petitions, declarations. The Continental Congress convened, and men of every colony gathered to debate what course we should take. Some still clung to hope, fearful of breaking with Britain, while others demanded independence with fire in their eyes. I entered those halls as one who had been mocked in London, humiliated before the Privy Council, and I carried the memory of those insults like embers in my heart. I spoke less than others, for age had taught me the power of silence. But when I did speak, I spoke with conviction, urging that we prepare not for reconciliation but for separation. It was in those days that Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston and I were appointed to draft a declaration, a document that would announce to the world our right to be free. Jefferson took the lead with his pen, young and eloquent, but we all shaped the words. I reviewed his draft, suggesting changes, smoothing phrases, strengthening its resolve. I remember holding that parchment, knowing it was not merely ink and paper, but the birth certificate of a nation. When, on the 4th of July in 1776, we adopted it, the bells rang, the people cheered, and I felt the weight of history settle upon us. I said then, and I believed it deeply, that we must all hang together, or surely we would all hang separately. The struggle that followed was long and bitter. Armies clashed, farms burned, families were torn apart. Britain sent its might against us, and we, ragged and untrained, stood against it with courage alone. But courage cannot win wars without allies, and it was to me that the task fell of seeking aid abroad. Congress sent me to France to persuade that great kingdom to support our cause. At 70 years old, I crossed the ocean once more, not as a petitioner of Parliament, but as an ambassador of liberty. France received me with fascination. To them I was not a colonial printer, but a philosopher, a man of science, a symbol of the New World's promise. I dressed plainly, wearing my fur cap instead of powdered wigs, and the French adored me for it. In their salons, among nobles and philosophers, I spoke of freedom, of equality, of a republic rising across the ocean. They listened, enchanted not only by the novelty of America, but by the idea that a man of humble birth could rise so high by merit alone. I negotiated tirelessly, using wit and patience where force would fail. I charmed the ladies of Versailles, debated with ministers, played the game of diplomacy with a smile and a jest, all while pressing the serious cause of alliance. It was not easy. France feared Britain, feared entanglement, but they also hungered to see their rival weakened. I pressed upon them that America could not stand without aid, that our cause was just, and that if liberty triumphed here, it might yet inspire the world. At last I succeeded. France pledged money, supplies, ships and soldiers. Their fleets crossed the Atlantic. Their generals fought beside ours. Without them, independence might have remained a dream. With them, it became reality. When the treaty was signed, binding France to our cause, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any invention, deeper than any discovery. For in that moment, I had secured the survival of the nation we had only just declared. Those years in France were both wearying and exhilarating. I was old, often ill, burdened with responsibilities, yet I found strength in the knowledge that I served a cause greater than myself. The French embraced me as one of their own, printing my face on medallions, hanging my portrait in their homes, praising me as the embodiment of America. I accepted their affection with gratitude, but I never forgot the hardships of my countrymen. While I dined in gilded halls, soldiers shivered at Valley Forge, and I worked each day to ensure they would not suffer in vain. When news came of Yorktown, of Cornwallis's surrender, I knew the struggle was won. America was free, not in words but in fact. I lingered in France to finalize treaties, to secure recognition from other nations, to ensure that our infant republic would not be stillborn. And when at last I returned home, weary and aged, I found a new nation waiting, rough and fragile, but alive. I had begun life as a runaway apprentice, a printer of papers, a tinkerer with stoves and spectacles. I had become a diplomat, a founder, a signer of independence. And as I looked upon Philadelphia once more, I felt both pride and humility. Pride that I had played my part in birthing a republic. Humility that so much remained uncertain, so much yet to be built. For liberty once won must be guarded, and unity once declared must be maintained. The work was not finished. It had only begun. When I returned from France, exhausted yet triumphant, I found myself once again at the heart of a nation that was free but fragile. Independence had been declared, the war won, but the peace was far from secure. The Articles of Confederation bound the states together loosely, but already cracks were forming. Each state jealously guarded its own power, reluctant to surrender authority to any central body. Debts from the war pressed heavily. Foreign powers watched hungrily, and disunity threatened to undo all that had been gained. I was old now, my body failing, my strength diminished, Yet my mind remained clear, and my sense of duty unshaken. I had lived long enough to see the colonies rise from obscurity to independence, and I would not see them collapse through folly. So once more I took my place in the service of the Republic, lending what wisdom and energy I still possessed to the great task of building a nation that could endure. It was in the Constitutional Convention of 1787 that my last and perhaps greatest service was rendered. Delegates from every state gathered in Philadelphia, the air thick with heat and tension. Some wished merely to amend the articles, others sought to replace them entirely. For months debate raged. Large states and small states clashed over representation, northern and southern interests wrestled over commerce and slavery, advocates of strong central government battled defenders of states' rights. I watched these quarrels with concern, for I had seen how easily division could undo the noblest of causes. At 81 years of age, I was the eldest of the delegates, my body so weakened that I had to be carried into the hall each day. Yet my presence reminded them all of continuity, of experience, of the long struggle that had brought us to this point. I spoke sparingly, saving my words for moments when tempers flared, when compromise seemed impossible. Then, with calm and humor, I urged them to find common ground. I reminded them that no man, no state, no faction could have all it desired, and that a republic rests not on perfection but on cooperation. When disputes over representation threatened to derail the convention, I supported the compromise that created two houses of Congress, one reflecting the people, the other the states. When arguments over executive power grew heated, I urged caution but also unity, knowing that without energy in government, the Republic would fail. I did not win every debate, nor did I seek to. My aim was to preserve the convention itself, to prevent collapse, to hold the delegates together until a constitution could be written. I recall the day when the document at last lay before us, complete after long months of labor. Many still doubted, still grumbled, still pointed to flaws. I rose then, frail yet firm, and spoke words that came from the deepest part of my heart. I told them that I had often wondered, as I looked upon the sun painted on the back of the president's chair, whether it was a rising or a setting sun. Now, I said, I knew it to be a rising sun. Imperfect though the Constitution was, it was our best hope, and I urged every man to sign it, to present to the world not division, but unity. And so they did, each adding his name, binding us together in a framework that endures to this day. That Constitution was not flawless. It did not abolish slavery. It did not resolve every conflict. It left much still to be tested. But it created a structure strong enough to hold, flexible enough to adapt, clear enough to endure. For me, it was the culmination of decades of striving, the embodiment of the union I had first imagined in Albany so many years before. At last, the states were not merely bound by necessity, but united by design. In those final years, I reflected often on the strange journey of my life. I had been a runaway apprentice, a printer, a writer of witty almanacs. I had flown kites into storms, invented stoves and spectacles, charmed kings and courtiers, signed declarations and treaties. I had helped give birth to a nation, and then helped secure its survival. Few men are granted such a life, fewer still live to see its fruits. I knew my time was short, but I was content. I had played my part, given my energy, my wit, my strength to the service of my fellow men. When I walked through Philadelphia's streets, I saw libraries filled with books, schools filled with children, fire brigades ready to act, hospitals tending the sick. I saw a constitution that bound 13 quarrelsome states into one nation. I saw the future, uncertain but alive, and I knew I could rest. I did not claim perfection, for I had many failings. My temper was quick, my vanity real, my indulgences not few, but I measured a man's worth not by his flaws, but by his contributions. And in that measure I found peace, for I had given all I could and the world was better for it. In the twilight of my days, as I set down my pen and closed my eyes to the noise of politics, I saw again the boy who had fled Boston, bread under his arm, pockets nearly empty, eyes burning with determination. That boy could never have imagined the path ahead, but he had within him the same fire that carried me through all storms. And as my life drew to its close, I felt gratitude above all. Gratitude for the chance to serve, to learn, to create, to leave behind not riches, but usefulness. For usefulness is the truest measure of a man, and in that I had found my immortality. In the years after the Constitution had been signed, and the framework of a new nation set in motion, I lived in a kind of twilight, a season of reflection as well as continued service. Though my body was weak, my mind remained sharp, and I lent it where it could still be of use. The convention had given us a government, but it had not erased the contradictions within our society. Chief among them was the institution of slavery, a stain upon the promise of liberty that weighed heavily on my heart. I had long wrestled with the matter. In my youth I had owned servants, as was common, but age and experience brought clarity. How could a republic that proclaimed the equality of all men tolerate such bondage? How could men who had themselves fought for freedom deny it to others because of the color of their skin? It was hypocrisy so glaring that even in my final years I could not rest without speaking against it. I became president of the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery, urging Congress to act, to end the trade, to set us on the path of true liberty. My petitions were received coolly and action was slow, but I had planted another seed. I knew it might not flower in my lifetime, but I hoped it would in time. As I grew older, my home became a place where visitors came from near and far. Young men seeking wisdom, scholars eager to speak of science, foreign dignitaries curious about the mind behind the lightning rod and the treaties of France. They found me often in bed or in my chair, wrapped in quilts, my body failing, yet still eager to converse. I shared stories, offered counsel, and listened as they spoke of the new nation's challenges and opportunities. I delighted in their company, for conversation had always been my greatest pleasure. In the exchange of ideas, I felt alive. I thought often of France, of the gilded halls where I had played the part of America, as philosopher with my fur cap and plain coat. Their revolution was unfolding, fiercer and bloodier than ours, and I feared for them even as I admired their passion. Liberty, once awakened, cannot easily be contained, but it is a dangerous fire if not guided by reason. I wondered whether they would find balance, or whether their storm would consume them. In this, as in all things, I trusted time to reveal the truth. My family too occupied my thoughts. My illegitimate son William had once stood with the crown during the Revolution, loyal to Britain, while I cast my lot with independence. Our bond had been broken by that choice, and though I forgave him in words, in truth, the wound never healed. It is the tragedy of my life that public duty sometimes cost me private peace. Yet I loved my children and grandchildren, and I strove in my last years to provide for them, to leave behind not only a nation, but a family secure. When I walked, or more often was carried, through Philadelphia in those last years, I marveled at how the city had grown. Streets I had once wandered as a ragged apprentice now bustled with commerce and learning. The library I had founded was rich with books, the fire brigade swift to act, the college thriving with students. These were the monuments I cherished, not statues or titles, but living institutions that served the people. They were proof that a man may leave behind usefulness more enduring than wealth. I also saw how my face had begun to appear on medals, portraits, and engravings, a strange experience for one who had begun life in obscurity. I took little pride in such honors, for fame is a fleeting thing. What mattered was not that my image was remembered, but that my principles were practiced. Industry, frugality, curiosity, service, these were the virtues I hoped America would carry forward. As my strength failed, I spent more time in reflection, writing my autobiography, though it remained unfinished at my death. In those pages, I sought to record not every detail, but the lessons of my journey, that others might learn from my experience. I wrote of the poor boy who fled Boston, of the young man who found opportunity in Philadelphia, of the experiments that drew fire from the sky, of the treaties that secured independence. I wrote with candor, admitting faults as well as triumphs, for I believed honesty is the truest legacy. I knew my end was near, and I faced it without fear. I had lived fully, served faithfully, erred often but corrected where I could. When death came in April of 1790, I was ready. Philadelphia mourned, tens of thousands filling the streets to pay their respects. Across the ocean, in France, they too honored me, seeing in me a symbol of liberty, a philosopher of the age. Even in London, where once I had been mocked, voices were raised in tribute. It was a strange fate for the son of a candle maker to be mourned in capitals across the world. I did not seek immortality, yet in some measure it found me. My inventions still serve, my sayings still circulate, my institutions still stand, my nation still lives. And though my body returned to the earth, my face would one day rest on the $100 bill, a reminder not of perfection but of possibility. For my life was proof that a man of humble birth, with no wealth, no title, no schooling, could through diligence and curiosity rise to shape a nation and inspire the world. As I reflect from beyond the veil of time, I do not see myself as a hero or a sage, but as a man who made himself useful. That was always my goal, and it is usefulness that endures when glory fades. I built libraries so minds could grow, hospitals so bodies could heal, fire brigades so homes could be saved, treaties so nations could survive. These are the things that matter. These are the true measures of a life. And so, as my story neared its end, I found peace. For I had done what I could with the years given me. I had lit a few candles in the darkness, and though the flame is small, it may yet kindle others. That is enough. That is all any man can hope for, to leave behind light where once there was none. In my final reflections, I saw the story of my life not as a tale of grandeur, but as a testament to what diligence, curiosity, and a willingness to serve can accomplish. I had begun as the son of a candle maker, with no fortune, no title, little schooling, and every disadvantage of birth. I had fled Boston a runaway, arrived in Philadelphia hungry and unknown, and through persistence carved out a place for myself. From the press I had found my first influence, through science I had discovered renown, and through politics I had joined in the founding of a nation. Each chapter of my life was marked not by ease but by effort, not by privilege but by persistence. What pleases me most as I reflect across the years is not that my name is remembered, but that the institutions I built still serve. The library, where the poor may read, the hospital, where the sick may find care, the fire brigades, where neighbors protect one another, the university, where the young may learn and grow. These were the true monuments of my life, not statues of stone or portraits in gilt frames, but living systems of usefulness. They were born not from wealth, but from the conviction that a community prospers when each man contributes to the common good. My inventions too remain in use. The stove warms, the spectacles aid vision, the lightning rod shields homes. I took no patent, sought no profit, for I believed knowledge is a gift meant to be shared. Let others enrich themselves with monopoly. I sought only the joy of seeing my work improve lives. For usefulness is a greater reward than gold. In the realm of politics, I had my share of victories and failures. I helped birth a declaration, secure alliances, craft a constitution. I opposed slavery, though I did not abolish it. I urged unity, though divisions endured. I strove always for compromise, for I knew men are stubborn and prideful, and without compromise a republic cannot survive. The constitution we forged was not perfect, but it was enough, and from it a nation has grown. That, I believe, is the truest measure of statesmanship, not to achieve the ideal, but to build something that lasts. My faults were many. I was vain, often indulgent, sometimes careless in private life. I quarreled with my brother, with my son, with colleagues. I made mistakes as all men do, yet I sought always to admit them, to correct them, to learn from them. I wrote my virtues and my failings in a little book, marking my lapses, striving for improvement. Perfection was never mine, but progress always was. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson I can offer, that a man need not be flawless to do lasting good. And so it is that my face, centuries later, rests upon the $100 bill, a curious honor, for I was never president, never crowned with the highest office. But perhaps it is fitting, for my life was devoted not to rule but to service, not to command but to creation. The bill is a symbol of commerce, of enterprise, of industry, and these were the realms in which I labored. I helped give America its first institutions of finance, its first sense of economic strength. I believed in thrift, in saving, in industry, in the power of small acts repeated daily. To see my face on that bill is to see those values honored. Yet I would not want to be remembered only for money. I would want to be remembered for the words I wrote, the ideas I pursued, the communities I built, the wisdom I shared. For wealth vanishes, but wisdom endures. A penny saved is a penny earned, yes, but more importantly, a life devoted to service is a life well lived. When I died, I was laid to rest in Philadelphia, the city that had given me a home, the city I had sought to serve. Tens of thousands followed my procession, men and women, rich and poor alike, for they felt that one of their own had passed. That was the greatest honor of all, to be mourned not as a distant figure but as a neighbor, a fellow citizen. Now as you hold a $100 bill and see my face upon it, I ask only that you remember not the image but the story. Remember the boy who fled Boston with nothing, who found in books and work the means to rise. Remember the printer who used words to shape character, the scientist who drew lightning from the sky, the statesman who signed declarations and treaties, the elder who urged compromise and unity. Remember that greatness is not born of birth, but of effort, of curiosity, of service. That is my legacy, as plain and enduring as the paper your currency is printed on. And though centuries pass, though faces fade and nations change, I remain in those values, in those institutions, in that enduring truth, that a useful life is a noble life, and that even the humblest beginnings can lead to the shaping of a nation.